It was very random. It was all kinds of looks, ages, shapes, sizes, sexes, and even sexualities. There was a full smorgasbord. It was much more a miscellany of, and quite therefore reflective of Camden, which in the 80s and then, well, since the 70s, but through the 80s had increasingly been the kind of London's East Village mix of punks to hippies to whoever. So the Black Cat was a local bar that was punching above its weight at the time, and just a good time without any self-consciously stylized aesthetic or anything. It was a regular local pub.
I am Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, the podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. Mark Brummitt is an Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and Assistant Dean of Students at a small postgraduate college in Rochester, New York. In the early 90s, however, after a decade of service, he left his role as a Salvation Army lieutenant and started exploring his queerness at the Black Cap, an iconic bar in Camden, London.
So the HIV crisis had filled the papers from mid to late 80s, and by 90s, while things were still pretty bleak, and it was still the dominant story in many respects, things had reached a kind of plateau in some ways. And what was interesting in the early 90s is that there was a gay village as such appearing in Soho. There was a gay culture. There were now gay characters appearing on TV. It was a time when there was a shift of some kind going on. I'm not going to suggest that it moved into a utopian anything goes Britain, but there was definitely a shift going on, and things were becoming more recognized, more understood, and more mainstream in many ways. And that has its gains and losses, of course. But the Black Cap at the time for me was a place of going down the rabbit hole or going through the looking glass, to use the Alice analogies, or maybe to use a more contemporary one, Harry Potter. It was going into Diagon Alley. It was discovering the wizarding world that was there all the time. You know, I went from my muggle self to my wizarding self. And the Black Cat for me was the portal. How's that for a nice analogy?
I mean, all the Harry Potter references are lost on me, but it was lovely.
There we are. So you get a sense of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It was my entry point into a world and place of discovery. The Black Cat was, it was a very lovely thing for me at the time.
So, early 90s in London.
Yes.
What was going on for you at that time?
I was leaving one significant job and starting another. And it was significant because it was quite a lifestyle change. I had been running a small Salvation Army mission in Victoria. Mm-hmm. And part of that job was also to be one of the Salvation Army officers. There's a big Salvation Army in Oxford Circus, and I was realizing that while that had been an exciting thing to do in my late teens, early 20s, for a good many reasons, from the theological to the moral, it was time for me to exit that world. And I was already a registered nurse, so I went into care, cancer care, oncology. So I left the Salvation Army and started working as a nurse at the Royal Marsden Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And this was at still peak AIDS. AIDS was still a dominant, was still dominating the news, was still very current in the LGBTQI community at the time.
Mm-hmm. If we could just quickly talk about Salvation Army.
Yes.
Are they not kind of very well known for being quite homophobic?
The Salvation Army started out as a very radical movement in the 1860s, allowing women in the pulpit, inviting all kinds of underclass type people to their venues and their events.
So are you saying women are underclass?
So absolutely, in the 1860s, that was the thought of a woman being in a pulpit was not going to fly very comfortably, but they were doing all these daring and radical things. And then by the 1930s, or from the 1930s onwards, it became moved increasingly towards conservative positions, so that by the 1980s, the Salvation Army was not treating and giving support to people, no questions asked. It was really very able or uncomfortable with dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis at the time, and largely because of its stance towards homosexuality. That was the official position, which made it rather awkward. But within the Salvation Army ranks itself, there was many a gay and a lesbian, and many a person who just didn't bother with whatever the official party line was. Their motivation was compassion. And so in the early 90s, with some friends in Camden town, we set up a Salvation Army HIV drop-in center called Chalk Farm Oasis. And there was a Salvation Army HIV drop-in centre Oasis in not Wimbledon. Was it Wimbledon? Somewhere in South London, and another one in Cardiff, and then another one starting in Manchester. So there were these healthy, hopeful pockets.
Mm-hmm.
So there is more to, like anything like that, there is more to the story than the general opinion. But for me, working for the Salvation Army, it was not a possible position to be particularly out, and I'm not a tactful person by nature, and I realized I couldn't stay within the Salvation Army for theological and therefore moral reasons as well, in that I just didn't follow that party line, nor could I. So I left.
And then went into nursing. So what was that transition like for you?
It was surprisingly easy. I'd only been out of nursing about 4 years, and I'd done the full RN training, and then a year afterwards. And I finished at the Salvation Army on a Sunday night, and at 7:00 the next morning, I was at the Royal Marsden in a men's white tunic and getting myself back into the swing of woodwork. And it was a fantastic job. It was bloody hard work, but it was a fantastic job. And I continued my involvement with the Salvation Army through the Chalk Farm Oasis HIV drop-in centre. And so it was surprisingly smooth.
And so then what else was going on in your life at that time?
Well, then I was suddenly given license to thrill, as it were, and I could start frequenting some of London's popular hostelries at the time. The Salvation Army isn't really a pub culture unless it's selling the war cry, and I had not really been going to bars and clubs at all, and now decided that, yes, I was going to start doing that. And so after our Monday night Salvation Army Chalk Farm HIV drop-in centre evening, I would go with some friends and we would go to the Black Cap in Camden. And that became the hub of life at that time. I was living with a good friend in Tufnell Park. She was a nurse at the Moorfields Eye Hospital, and even though we were doing shifts which often began at 7 or 7:30 in the morning, we were dancing several nights a week at the Black Cap till about 2 a.m.
So at this time, was it your first kind of time going to Black Cap, or was it?
Yes, really.
Yeah. And do you remember the first time you went there?
No.
Do you have any lingering ideas of first impressions?
I remember, I think the first few times I went, which would have been just before I'd fully left the Salvation Army, and just that the DJ was at the bar, and it was this, I just remember the narrowness of the dance area down the stairs, this long, narrow strip alongside the bar until you get to the dance area by a little stage at the back, and seeing the major acts of the time, because it was very much a drag bar, and you would have a 20-minute drag break in the middle of the evening, even though it was a dance club effectively. And it was Regina Fong and Titular Camp and figures like that.
So I didn't live in London in the 90s, but Regina Fong is pretty legendary.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories of shows that she was performing in?
Oh gosh, yes. Now there's a guy who lives a few blocks away from me, and I'm in Rochester, New York, which is up towards Buffalo and the Canadian border. I've got a friend who's a few blocks away from here. He is a South Londoner, probably around about the same age as me, and we will talk about Regina Fong every now and then, because she had a set of what we would, I guess, nowadays call memes. There were little skits she would do, and she would do them every time, and the whole audience would join in. And basically, she would lip sync to sound bites from ads and from songs or shows from the 50s and 60s and 70s, and she would just mime them on stage. And there were songs like "There's a Worm at the Bottom of the Garden, His Name is Wiggly Woo," and she would have actions, and everybody in the audience would copy those actions, and then she would do the typewriter, and there would be this piece of hurried 1950s or 60s orchestral music, and she would mime typing frantically. So that was really Regina Fong's shtick.
But so what do you think set her apart from other drag queens of the time?
I don't know. I think her name suggests a certain dignity and royal status, which she very, very much embodied. I don't know. I think she'd been doing it so long, she had become an institution. There was something about the simplicity and absurdity of that act, which was really nothing more than performing this well-known series of skits and abusing the audience between each one, which just worked.
You can never go wrong when you're abusing the audience, really, can you?
You know, that sort of sassing the audience in the usual way, which is really sort of baseline for a good drag queen, and it worked wonderfully.
Do you remember any other drag queens from that time?
Well, I remember Titular Camp doing a marvellous Karen Carpenter sketch.
Wasn't making fun of eating disorders, was it?
And moving swiftly on, a series of very bad taste skits which covered Jackie O and a few others, none of which I will go into details on, but it was just so awful and so on the nail that it was just hysterical. One of the funniest things I ever saw there was quite a bit later. I'd been living in America already for a year, and I was back, and this must have been very late 90s. And I was there with a friend, and a drag queen came out with, she had a broomstick across her shoulders so that she had two dummies hanging either side of her, and so there was 5 figures in a row, and she performed Wannabe. And each of the heads, the 2 heads either side, were ventriloquist dummy heads, and so she was making the mouths work frantically, and it was the Spice Girls in Muppet form, and it was perfect. It was absolutely hilarious. Brilliant.
Oh. Which Spice Girl are you most like?
Do I have to have an opinion?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think you're Victoria, really.
Do you?
Yeah, I'd say.
Can't I have Scary?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's your question to answer.
Okay. Is it possible not to have a Spice Girl at all?
Oh.
I enjoy them as a collective. I couldn't care less about them as individuals. Can I put it like that?
Brilliant. Yeah, poetic. So let's talk about your romantic life at this time.
Oh, yes.
What was going on?
A lot, but it wasn't very romantic.
Oh. Okay, your sexual life at this time.
Yeah, it's taken me a long time to recognize that I have always been compelled or propelled by choices which don't make relationships very sustainable or easy, and that given the choice, I will often choose other than the relationship. I was in a very good relationship in London, a very happy relationship in London, and I was offered a job in Rochester, New York, and I accepted the job before I'd even thought about the relationship, is what I mean. So I'm basically... What I'm saying is I'm not hugely designed to be kind to other people in relationship. That my primary relationship is rather with my work.
So you're not relationship oriented. That's
not romantic relationship oriented necessarily, and in some ways I am nevertheless very much a romantic. I had a big falling in love experience when I was in the Salvation Army with a guy who I was working with, and there was reciprocation, but it was rather an impossible circumstance, which for him was a major source of concern, and for me, I rather enjoyed the cloak and dagger creeping around late at night side of things, but it wasn't sustainable long term, and he has been in what appears to be a successful heterosexual marriage for the last 30 years, and I have not. So, but I left the Salvation Army a little bit heartbroken with the end of that relationship and kind of ready to have a good time. So the Black Cap was my hunting ground, and there was many a night I would leave the Black Cap, and many a morning I would be working out what part of London I was in at that moment.
Okay, so you've used the term hunting ground.
Yep.
Let's maybe explore that a bit. Are you always the instigator?
No, I don't have, strangely, although I'm probably perceived as very confident, and in many ways I am a confident person. I do not have, I'm sexually pretty confident, but I don't have a very high opinion of my looks or my pulling power, or certainly then I didn't. So remember, I've been in the Salvation Army for a decade, from the age of 15 to about the age of 25. So I was a bit of an innocent, not that much of an innocent, and not for very long, let's face it. But I would stand there not really feeling competitive. I would be looking and interested, but not really thinking that in the great scheme of, in the hierarchy of sexual choices, I didn't consider myself to be very high.
So then how did you end up waking up in strange places?
Because I still did okay. What I'm meaning is that I was not necessarily I say the hunting ground, but I was not necessarily.
You were just there to sweep up the dregs.
Let's put it that way. No, I mean, I did fine. I was not necessarily going in there and clicking my fingers and having the guys swoon, but I did fine. I did okay. Plenty of nights I would be snogging randoms on the dance floor and then thinking, well, I'll go with this one tonight, but next week I'll go with that one, and that's how it worked. So, I had a dance card, and yeah.
So where is the best place in the club to pick someone up?
On the dance floor, I would, in my experience, on the dance floor, you could be dancing away, and it wasn't. Well, obviously it was cruisy, but most people were there having a good time. And if you went regularly, and I was going 3 or 4 times a week, you would get to know many of the faces. And so you would end up just befriending them on the dance floor and dance with the same ones several times a week. And things would flow from there.
Yeah, eventually they'd lean in and...
Yeah, in every sense, yeah. And just to put it in context, I mean, I've told you this story, and it's a good story, so I'm determined to crank it in. And I hadn't been entirely innocent in the Salvation Army when that relationship that I had in the Salvation Army was breaking down. I was already starting to think about and explore my sexuality at that time. And London Underground, for me, in the late 80s, early 90s, was a pretty good pulling place. I would be traveling on the Underground and eyes would meet across a crowded rush hour train. And yeah, I did fine. I had a good time in London.
So then on the Underground, what time of day?
Oh, any time of day.
Any time of day?
I mean, my favourite story is the one where I was in full Salvation Army uniforms, this high neck with the collar with S's on it and the hat, and this rather tall and handsome guy was standing next to me, and our eyes kind of met, and I noticed our knuckles were brushing, and it was rush hour, so that's not unusual. And then his fingers entwined with mine, and there was that little frisson of excitement. And then the next thing, I realized he'd placed his business card in my hand. So, of course, I called him.
Wait, before that, though, what was his business?
Well, it was just his name on a card. I don't remember what his business was. I know what he used to do. He was a window dresser at Selfridges.
Ah, okay.
But he didn't say that on the card. I don't remember. It was just one of those cheap out of a Ryman's machine cards with his name and number on it. So maybe he did this a lot.
Did people do that?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, wow. Okay, sorry. So you called him.
I called him and we went, I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday night. We met at First Out. Is it still there?
Oh, no. Long
Coffee
gone.
shop. Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I've been living here 14 years. Can you believe it? Yeah, it was a coffee shop just at the top, but just near Tottenham Road Underground station, tube station. And it was, as the name suggests, a gay venue. And it was a place where people would meet for lunch or meet before going out in the evening. And so we met there as a safe, comfortable venue. This would have been 1991, November of 1991. And he turned up and he's an emotional mess. I was like, I don't even remember his name. Isn't it awful? And I said, are you all right? What's going on? And he said, I've had a terrible 24 hours. And basically, it was the night. The night before was the night that Freddie Mercury had died. And he had spent most of the night at a vigil at Mercury's house, at the gates of Mercury's house. And he was an emotional and overtired wreck. And so I said to him, well, do you want to go home and, call it another night? And he said, no, I'm here now and I need cheering up. So we had a coffee at first out, and then we decided we would walk into Soho, which was only just becoming the gay village at the time, and go to a new bar called The Village. So we walked to the village and chatted politely as we went along, and he was quite weepy still, and every now and then would have a wave of emotion and get very tearful about Freddie Mercury. And we got to the village and we went inside, and the first person I saw at the bar was my brother. Who I didn't see very much, and I didn't know he was gay. He didn't know I was gay. He looked appalled at the sight of me, which we've never been close. So we often would look appalled at each other anyway, but all I was to him was his Salvation Army brother. And so he presumed I was very much a homophobe, not a homophile. And, what are you doing here? I think he thought I must have been on a mission or evangelizing or selling the war cry. And I said, what do you think I'm doing here? And while I was talking to him, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the guy I was with. And he said, well, who's this? Rather rudely in front of the guy. And I said, well, it's who I'm with tonight. And you could just see the math going on behind my brother's eyes. Gosh, I've lived in America 14 years, haven't I? I just said math instead of maths. I do apologize to listeners back at home. So, and my date of the night, who was already freaked out and upset about the death of Freddie Mercury, was now completely freaked out by me and my brother bumping into each other and having this kind of surprise mutual outing. So we just called it a night.
Aww.
I went back to his and we shagged like goodness knows what, but we didn't bother staying out any longer.
So that's your version of calling it a night.
Yeah, that's right. Called it a night. Yeah. Made it a night, I should say.
But so, like, what's the age difference between you and your brother?
2 years.
So not that big an age difference.
Not that big an age difference, but even as little kids, we didn't play well together. In fact, we didn't really play together. I was quite social, and as I say, trolling around the house in my mother's clothes. And why he didn't, I don't know. Anyway, whereas he would sit in his corner of the bedroom and take a clock apart and put it back together again or something like that. His play for him was very solitary and technical. By the age of 15 or 16, he was recognized to be gifted at language learning and maths, and went to an entirely different secondary school from me because of his genius, whereas I was at the local comprehensive throwing, a good day was sticking pasta to pieces of coloured paper or something like that.
And then spray painting it gold?
Yes.
Great,
so,
brilliant.
yeah. So, precisely. So we lived in... We were very, very, very different people, and we didn't really ever connect, and haven't done since.
So that didn't that meeting at the village didn't change anything for your relationship?
We went to what was the big dance club in Brixton at the time? The Garage?
The Fridge.
The Fridge. The Fridge. The Garage is up in Glasgow. The Fridge. And we went to the Fridge, I think, once together. And as soon as we got there, we went our separate ways. And since the mid-90s, he's lived in, I think Frankfurt for 7 or 8 years and Copenhagen ever since. So we've never been close, and we haven't really even been in the same
time
region.
Zone. Yeah. Okay. So when you were talking about your hunting ground,
Yes.
you said that you woke up in strange parts of London.
Yes.
Are there any particular times that stick out in your mind?
Yeah. Um, One time, a Belgian guy, um, short, stout, shaved, cropped hair, who I thought was the sex. And one night he kind of beckoned me over and we were snogging and ended up back at his place, which was only just across Camden High Street. And we got into his dark apartment and we're going for it on the sofa. And then I heard a noise and I realized this was a studio and we were on the sofa and there was a bed across the room. And in that bed was his boyfriend.
And the boyfriend was delighted you were there or horrified you were there?
I think deeply asleep and just turning over in bed.
Oh, so he didn't wake up?
Not that I remember. And I suspect
gosh.
if he had woken up, I would remember. So that rather, it threw a dampener over
Bit of a
everything.
boner killer, right?
Well, yeah. So I got on the home back to Tufnell Park. Got back on the bus home to Tufnell Park.
Oh, and it could have been so good.
Yeah.
And so the black cap. Let's go back there.
The black cap.
That's what we're here to talk about. What was the general vibe like?
Back then, in the early 90s, it was very much a local. You would have people from all over the place, but there was a kind of a core of people from the Camden, from Camden region in general. So there were a lot of the same faces night after night, week after week. Monday was, if I remember rightly, free entry and half price drinks. It was oldies and trash night. And it was just there was no drag act that night. It was a lovely party feel where the music would be everything from the 60s, 70s, 80s, any old pop really. And, just good fun dancing and pretty crowded. And then other nights had various themes. I don't really remember, but there would be often a drag act. And it was a very popular venue at the time. And it was really only when Soho was getting going as a gay village and Vauxhall hadn't been invented as anything gay as far as I'm aware.
So I had thought that Soho had always been kind of pretty gay.
Not in the commercial gay village way it became. I think it'd always been the red light, porn shop, sex shop, porn, cinema, nook, but it hadn't become the kind of commercial Pink Pound venue that it became in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. And so we're going back to Salvation Army. I'm so sorry to labor on this. You said you were there from 15 to 25.
Yeah.
And
go for it. Ask what you want.
No. I mean, the word that is kind of on the tip of my tongue is oppressive, but I'm not sure if that's the exact word I want to use. But it was quite a rigid lifestyle.
That's not unfair, but it wasn't oppressive.
Okay.
When I thought it was going to become oppressive, I left.
Uh-huh.
And for me, it was actually very liberating, which is a surprising thing. It was disciplined. Let's call it disciplined.
Okay.
For various reasons, practical as well as moral, the Salvation Army, since its onset sounds like a disease, since it began to become one of its fully signed up members, you promise not to drink or gamble or even swear. It's a cleaned up lifestyle in that sense. And one of the reasons was that its primary work in the 1860s onwards was among alcoholics. and people with various addictions. So it was like an early AA or 12-step kind of thing, in that everybody was in a kind of salvation recovery. And so the lifestyle reflected that. If you were a member, even if you'd not been an alcoholic ever yourself, or had any known addictive issues, you would nevertheless not participate on behalf of everybody that was part of it. That's kind of the ethos to begin with. And so it was a disciplined lifestyle. But I had been a very secondary school had not been school period had not been easy for me. I was very much a bullied child. I was very clearly the sissy. I was nowadays I would be very much diagnosed with ADHD. I mean, I am diagnosed with ADHD, but it wasn't a diagnosis that was bandied around at the time. But I didn't do well in class at any level. I would be a truant whenever possible. I would just walk away and go home. I did that a lot, and I didn't really know how to fit into the world as a teenager or as a child. I lived in my imagination more than anywhere else. I didn't have a companion in my brother. As I became a teenager, I did make good friends. Several best friends are friends I've had since about the age of 8 or 9, which I don't know whether that's a good thing or a sad thing, but I didn't know how to be in the world very easily, for all kinds of reasons. And the Salvation Army, for some reason, had long been an interest. There was something about it which, I don't know, caught my imagination. I did have a stray. I wasn't brought up in any way religious. I had a strange sort of religious leaning, which goodness knows where that came from. And for some reason, I found a sense of place and purpose in the Salvation Army, a sense of a discipline which was helpful given my ADHD, and didn't feel oppressive, felt like a helpful schedule, that kind of thing. felt like a helpful sense of order, and not control but containment almost, which for a good while was a very healthy environment. My family life sort of fell apart mid-teens. My mother became sick and died when I was 16, 17, so older end of teens. My brother was at university. My father didn't cope well with this at all, and quit his job and went to Australia to stay with a friend for about 6 months. So by my mid to late teens, I was quite a solitary figure at home. And the Salvation Army environment, and there must have been a good 80 or so people at our local Salvation Army church, became this extended family, and was incredibly, there was somewhere to be and people to relate to all the time. And it was a rather safe and happy and life-giving environment at that time. And then I became increasingly aware that I was a big old woofter, and I never had a kind of an internal self-hatred. It was always a strategic issue to me. I am gay. I don't have a problem with that. I know the Salvation Army does. I love my life in the Salvation Army. I love the people I am working with here. How do I do that? And a very naive 17, 18, 19-year-old thought that I could sacrifice my sexuality for a greater sense of purpose in the Salvation Army. And by my early 20s, that
you got horny.
Yeah. That was not sustainable, and it was not sustainable. And also, it became clear that it was a lack of integration in my life that way. That maybe this is not the kind of lifestyle that will work for me long time. It had been a safe haven, which was now become. I was like a plant. I needed a good growing. I needed a good plant pot to grow in, but after a while, my roots and tendrils were going beyond that pot. Okay? And nothing wrong with that pot, but I wasn't the right plant for it. So, I needed to ramble.
So you mentioned before that you were bullied at school for being being a sissy.
Yeah, a bit of a sissy and a bit posh.
A bit.
Yeah.
And so at the time that you joined the Salvation Army, were you aware of your sexuality?
Yeah.
Okay, but you thought, so it wasn't from a place of internalized homophobia that you thought it
No,
could be managed.
no.
No.
My parents were quite traditional, but they weren't deeply conservative. My mother was very much a local actress, and she was chairing the Arts Council. I had a lot of unofficial
Therefore,
uncles who were very camp, very gay, theatrical darlings. So interestingly, I never had an opportunity to talk to my mother about it because she died, as I say, when I was about, I think, just turned 17 or something. But my dad, who only died about 5 or 6 years ago, I never spoke to him about it, and for very particular reasons. For him, he was not, how to put this? If I had told him I was gay, he would have made it his stress, his issue. He would have struggled with that. He would have worried about it. He would have worried that I would get sick. He would worry that I was going to be lonely. He was a teacher, and he had in the evenings been doing math classes for people with learning issues, and one of the people in one of his evening classes had been a young guy who was hard of hearing, and that had been his learning issue. And so my dad gave him extra math classes, and he was murdered outside an East End pub in the 70s, and it was a gay bar, and it was a homophobic attack. And my father never really got over that. And in some ways, I didn't share my story with my dad because he was quite a bit older, and it would have been a huge source of anxiety and worry to him, giving his understanding of that world, which was so very different from my understanding. So,
so you protected him.
Yeah, I wasn't brought up in a particularly homophobic environment. I wasn't brought up in a particularly religious environment, and the Salvation Army experience I had was not strongly homophobic. In fact, it's compassion and love. The culture of compassion and love was stronger than some of its moral coordinates, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. But so at the same time, at 25, when you when you left the Salvation Army, you were ready to explore bits of yourself.
Yeah. Well, bits of others as well.
Bits of yourself alongside others. Yeah. What was that like? Did you feel that you had lots of catching up to do?
Not really. No.
Did you feel naive in comparison to other people?
A little bit, but I was never hugely naive. I had made choices not out of fear particularly, but out of, as I say, there were choices. There were strategic choices. They were almost missional, vocational choices, which I then chose against eventually. But I was not. There was a certain innocence about me. I hadn't ever been, even at home, even though my parents were not strongly religious, they were not drinkers. We didn't really have alcohol in the house. I don't remember them ever drinking. And so I hadn't ever been to a pub particularly. So this was not necessarily my world, but I wasn't particularly scared of it. I didn't feel like a fish out of water. I'm not even particularly, I was drunk plenty of times in my late 20s, early 30s, but I'm to this day not I don't think there's any alcohol in my house. I'm not a strongly drinking person. It was not an environment that I was immediately used to, but I didn't feel hugely fish out of water or anything. I was more like a child in a toy shop.
What do you miss most about that time of your life?
Um, a certain sense of possibility and liberation, a certain sense of discovery. In the 18 months after leaving the Salvation Army, I got jiggy at the Black Cap. I went into, I got a job which was in many ways a revelation. I was working as a registered nurse at the Royal Marsden Hospital on a ward where it was pretty intense treatments of people with lymphomas, sarcomas, and melanomas. And there was a lot of death and a lot of pretty desperate chemotherapeutic treatments going on. And I was amazed by the staff I was working with, who are all highly trained in cancer care, and the hospital was run and led by the work and the research of nurses, not just research doctors, but nurses led the way in many respects. And it was a revelation what I learned about nursing practice and caring for people in such desperate situations. It was a liberation in that on my time off, not only was I dancing at the Black Cat, but I was catching up educationally. I had not done well at secondary school, at school at all. I left with not very much to my name, and I had got enough to do the RN training in the old days when it was hospital based, but I had never been to college and done a college or university degree or anything. And I decided that I wanted to, and I was doing some studies to get entry into a university, and I had never considered myself particularly academically capable. My brother was the brilliant one in school. I was the one that would wear my mother's pearl earrings and dance around in the garden singing show tunes.
Which was your show tune of choice?
I Have Confidence. Friend Leslie and I would enact this in its totality at the drop of a hat on any possible occasion, and very sadly still do. And she's got a daughter who is a brilliant actress, singer, dancer in the West End now, and who just looks at her mum and her mum's best friend and oh God, you're so fucking embarrassing, and storm off. But we don't care. And yeah. Where were we? What we were talking about?
Oh, sorry, I distracted you.
It's all right. I'm knitting. So my Black Cap years were 92 to 5, let's say. And by 1995, I was at college. I was doing really very well, but I was at King's College London during the week. Every weekend I was working 2 or 3 nursing night shifts to keep an income, and I didn't have an awful lot of time for going out and dancing, so I didn't really go to the Black Cat very much for a long while. And then in 97 I moved to New York City for a year I got a scholarship to do a master's degree there, and when I came back I went to the Black Cat, and it felt different. And that was maybe largely because of me. I moved on in the sense that it wasn't quite the toy shop that it had once represented to me. And I think gay venues had moved on. The Soho was a much more established nook. There was a lot more going on there. There were other venues around. There were bigger clubs. And the Black Cat was a little bit emptier, didn't have the same party stroke family lively feel, and perhaps it was mostly to do with me and what I was looking for.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? That yeah, like that thing about romanticizing spaces and romanticizing people and romanticizing things, and then feeling let down.
Yeah. And I think that there was a mixture of these things. I was at 30 and in my early 30s, I was not going to be the 25-year-old just out of the Salvation Army who found a wonderland in his local venue. Things had shifted. I'd shifted. It did not represent what it once did, as I've said, and maybe itself had changed, and maybe even my memories were as much a nostalgia and a fantasy as a reality, or certainly have been shaped by a mood and a moment that was specific to that moment. And so now to go back, I wasn't going to find what I'd found at 25. So how's that for elegiac?
Oh, fancy words. You're using so many fancy words today.
I am sorry.
Did you ever go to Black Cat? Well, if you did, I would love to hear from you. Tell me any stories or anecdotes you have from the time you went there, and share any photos through social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the username KAndersonMusic. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I've been writing songs about queer venues and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the coming year. You can hear the first single, Well Groomed Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking, on all streaming platforms. If you liked this episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told someone who you think might also be interested in hearing the story. I am Kay Anderson, and you've been listening to Lost Spaces.